Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Pocket Theology. Jason, what's going on, man?
Yeah, so I had an interesting conversation with a local pastor and talking about, again, we just saw a very well known pastor who's ending up stepping away from ministry. So we had quite a long conversation about why is this happening. We talked about character, the things that God cares about, but I think the bigger part is understanding the grace of God, the Father, and how do we get to a place so that when we do sin, we know we can return. But then how do we get to the place that we don't want to leave the Father in the first place, if
Mm.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we talked about all those things today. Really fun conversation. It goes back to Luke 15, where it talks about the parable of the prodigal son, or the two lost sons, or the prodigal father, however you want to define it. So it's a good episode.
Yeah, man. Yeah, so if that sounded interesting or encouraging to you at all, we're so glad that you're listening with us. If you wanted to send us any of your questions, thoughts, or even kind remarks, we would love if you would send us an email at podcast@zionclearlake.org. And if you wanted to be extra special, you could always share and like wherever it is that you're listening. So thank you and enjoy.
Dude,
Dude,
you're so far away.
I know.
We got our new setup.
Yeah. And now I'm too far away.
You're too far.
Are we even actually friends anymore now that I'm
It's
all
a
the way
long
over here?
distance relationship.
One, yeah. Yeah, man. No, I mean, we're trying it out. It looks different for sure. For those of you who are just listening, I it doesn't matter.
Well, okay, so this is our second podcast doing the new setup,
Yep.
and so you're doing all the switching and live stuff.
Yeah. They can't see it, but I look like a tech wizard over here. But I'm learning.
You're learning.
Yeah.
So what's the most difficult part about what you're doing now? Is it because you got to press buttons and all that?
Yeah, so now I'm anticipating every time we talk, like every time you talk and every time I talk. This will be easier, just the two of us. But
Yeah.
the first time we tried it with Megan, I'm sure there were a lot of really weird cuts because I didn't know when you were going to
So
talk.
do you have like a big, so that if there ever is a weird cut, or is it just always going to be like sucks to be us? It's just whatever it is, it is.
No, so I mean, eventually, like I said, the process is going to look a lot different. I mean, they don't really care about this too much, but the editing software that I'm going to be learning how to use will make all of this so much simpler.
Nice.
Yeah.
You're the amazing. You're the man behind the curtain that nobody sees.
Yeah.
The great and powerful
Shout out to all my production guys.
Jaden.
No.
Okay, so we were actually I was having a conversation today, actually at the bank, with another pastor in town, and we were just kind of talking about some interesting things happening culturally, and I think we've talked about this in previous podcasts. Um, another very well known pastor just stepped down from ministry.
Step down or was made to resign?
The language they said was step down.
Okay.
A guy named Tony Evans, very well known pastor. You're familiar with
Tony Evans.
Yeah, Tony Evans. They didn't say it was an undisclosed reason, but it was a past sin, and I was interesting because
Like Kingdom Man Tony Evans.
yeah, Tony Evans.
Oh.
And so he just said, I didn't act on. He said, I'm holding myself accountable, or I'm being held accountable the same way I've asked other men to be held accountable for their lives, and so he's stepping down, and it seems like his elders and his team, but he removed himself as the lead pastor from his church this week.
Wow. That's pretty big news. I mean, that's like he's one of the few guys who by name I know. Like we toss around NTU, right? We toss around all those guys.
Yeah.
Tony Evans, I'm familiar with his content.
Well, yeah, we've watched and read, and so this was the conversation is, so this pastor I was talking to actually, he went to seminary where Tony Evans graduated from, and so Tony Evans would often come in and speak with his class, and so he knows him personally, and I said, it was interesting to see that, and he goes, they didn't disclose what the sin was, and he's like, and I don't know that I need to know, and I was thinking about that, and so there's one, I'm heartbroken again,
right?
Because and to his credit, now I know we can spin things to make it sound better than it is, but I don't think that's the case. What's going on here?
Yeah.
He said that there was some past sin that he had to deal with, and that part of that he needed some healing and restoration, and submitted himself to a process with his elders, very similar to another pastor that I respect, a guy named Matt Chandler.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds like a healthy process to this
Yeah.
issue. Like, I mean, it sounds like he's taking accountability.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because his work is kingdom man values and all that
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
stuff,
yeah.
and it's really powerful work. And so this is what got me thinking about it.
Okay,
Right,
okay.
we're all broken,
Mm-hmm.
and to some degree, I understand that pastors and leaders should be held to a different level of accountability.
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, would be the statement I make. Like, there are some things that if a pastor does in a leadership position, if it's abuse of power, like, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the hard part is that, like, in the last 10 years, we had Mark Driscoll, who now has a new church that's thriving, and he's still kind of a controversial figure, but his Mars Hill imploded
Mm.
about 10 years ago. I mean, they were one of the largest churches in the nation. And when he was fired, the whole network just blew apart.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you've had, well, geez, I can't even name them all, but there's several. Mike Bickle
Mm-hmm.
from International House of Prayer was found out to be doing abusive stuff. Ravi Zacharias. Um, um, uh,
The point being, we've in the last 10 years we've seen a lot
a,
of these figures.
a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
Carl Lentz from Hillsong, who just released a new podcast.
Oh,
And I was
those guys that do podcasts are always
and
so
they're
full
horrible,
of
right?
themselves.
One and so this is again what got me thinking about it. So Carl Lentz launched a new podcast, and he's been out of ministry now for 2 or 3 years. He's not stepping back into ministry. He's not going to be a pastor.
Sure.
And another podcaster, video guy that I watched, a guy named Ruslan. I never say his name right. Based out of my hometown, out in San Diego. But he actually talked about this podcast this podcast that Carl Lentz and his wife did, and he actually was very candid about what happened
Sure.
and what led to it. And the parts that I listened to, so I'm listening to Ruslan talking about the podcast that Carl Lentz and his wife did. So I didn't actually listen to the podcast that Carl Lentz did. I still need to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But then I saw Tony Evans comes out, and so this pastor and I were talking today at the bank, and he said, it's hard because you hear this stuff, and in one sense, when you don't tell people what's going on in the church, we automatically go to the worst things.
Right. I mean, speculation is a slippery slope.
Yeah, they're hiding something,
Yeah.
right? There must be worse. There must be more. It must have been this. That's why they're not telling it.
Right.
And human nature, I get that. The other side is, I think probably the grosser part is that as humans, we love gossip.
Oh, for sure.
And there's that part of us where, like, I want to know, not because I care, but because it's interesting, or it's one more thing to go, yep, see, there's pastors, they're all, and it's,
I also think it gives people a false sense of closeness.
yes.
So it's like why we love celebrity drama is it makes us feel like we're closer or more attached to them.
And so I see the Tony Evans stuff. I'm watching the Carl Lentz, and Carl Lentz, he said there were a few things that he said that I listened to that I was like, yeah, I don't agree with that. But overall, he took a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
Talked about what led to the stuff, to the abuse, to the affair, the things that happened at Hillsong. And
wow.
And I've seen some pastors who, when confronted with sin, handle it very well.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that they ignore it.
No.
Nope, they own it. They get counseling. Some step back into ministry after a period of healing and restoration, and usually with accountability. So like they've been told, hey, you're ready to go back in. There are other pastors who double down. I did nothing wrong.
Like nope, not me.
Yeah, it wasn't me. Even though it doesn't matter how much evidence you throw out. Oh, that's slander. They're just trying to ruin my reputation, right?
Sure.
And so now I'm watching and just kind of following with what's going on with Tony Evans. And there's this weird part where, in some sense, I see them saying, hey, they're not going to disclose the sin, which, as long as he's getting accountability, I think is good.
Yeah, I think discretion is wise.
The only time I would say that I think you have to.
I think if it involves someone's like personal safety, right?
Or if it comes out and it looks like you were hiding it, it makes it
Oh,
way
way
worse.
worse. Yeah.
Right? Because so like Matt Chandler, another pastor. Again, there's just been a slew of pastors recently, and this was also part of the conversation I had with this local pastor. Matt Chandler, they alluded to a little bit. It was an indiscretion with a woman, nothing sexual in nature. There were some unhealthy text messages that went between. And I listened to a podcast with Matt Chandler. He was being interviewed by Carrie Newhoff,
Mm.
and Matt Chandler just said, he goes, "Listen, I love my wife. I've never cheated on my wife, but there were some boundaries that were crossed, and I needed to figure out why."
Mm.
And he made an interesting comment, and he said, "And my elders asked me to step away, and now I'm going to make a full confession here." I was like, "Well, if it wasn't sexual, if it was just some inappropriate text messages that weren't even really inappropriate, they were just too close. They were relationally inappropriate, not content inappropriate."
So you're saying that, yeah, the content of the messages weren't necessarily like provocative. It was just you shouldn't be having those sorts of conversations with someone like
Yeah,
that.
he was stepping across some boundaries, and my first response was, that just seems like an overcorrection, like just figure out what's going on. And he actually addressed that, and he goes, "People gave my elders the worst time and thinking that they were being legalistic." And he goes, "The whole reason why I could come forward is because they're not legalistic.
Yeah.
Because they were safe, and they said, you need time to get, there's some stuff going on because this could have turned worse." And I was a little convicted. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I so desperately wanted to go." And not because of sin in my own life or because I was trying to hide something, but because sometimes it seems like the church overcorrects or undercorrects, right? So you
Yeah.
have some churches that want to whitewash all abuse and just ignore it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's wrong.
And then some just blacklist right away.
Yeah. And it felt like that's what was happening. And he was like, "Are you kidding me?" This group of men saw what was going on and they cared more about me and said, "You need a break, get some healing, step away." And then he came back.
Yeah.
And they were very clear. And he's like, and there was nothing salacious. There was nothing. It was just, and he goes, there was just some boundaries that were getting crossed, and I needed to figure out why, and I didn't live up to it. And I was like, "Well, that's really healthy."
So you say that you were convicted, like you like what did that convict in
Yeah,
you?
well, because my first response was to go, "Well, his leaders must be overcorrecting."
Oh, okay.
Instead of just saying, "Hey, no, you didn't do anything," because they admitted, they said, "Listen, he didn't do anything. There was nothing sexual in nature. There was nothing graphic.
Right.
It was just crossing some relational boundaries."
Yeah, and then the council came from more of like like a caring position where it was like, hey man, actually go wash your hands, not because you got blood on them, but just because you need to clean up a little bit.
Yeah, like this could have
Yeah,
gotten worse, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so
Preventative.
my conviction wasn't well, it wasn't that bad of a sin. My conviction was that I wanted to say, "Well, his elders acted too harshly,"
Okay, I see.
and I felt like
Is that from your? I mean, because you can sympathize more as a pastor.
partly as a pastor, but also because I've seen that other side where we live in a council culture. That's what it felt like. It felt like they were canceling
Oh,
him for something,
gotcha.
and he was like, "No." He goes, "This was." Again, it was, let's not make it worse than it was, but it was something that I needed to go get counseling for. I needed a time away, and they cared about me and got the restoration. And so often we think of restoration as necessary when somebody's fallen, when they've
Right.
done something horrible. And he's like, "No, I need to get it so I don't
Yeah.
fall."
Oh, and we're always so to tie it in with our faith, we're always taking steps further and further away from God and the sin in our lives, right? The
Yeah,
restorative process of that relationship isn't when you trip, fall, and scrape your knee. Sometimes it's when you might fall and
it's
trip and scrape your
before
knee.
it's the strengthening before things
Yeah,
get bad,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
And so I was like, "Wow." And here's what I'm grateful for. I actually have a group of men in my life that I know would do that. If I came in and said, "Here's what's going on," I know that I have my counsel, and then I
yeah,
have I have a spiritual leadership team
yeah,
that would go, "Jason, if you're not careful, this is going to happen.
yeah,
Go take care of yourself." I've got a team on staff
yeah.
that I could do that.
And if I'm correct, you mentioned it in the podcast last week. You've started to see a spiritual, like not counselor, but
Oh, a spiritual director.
yeah.
Yeah, and so so this is ultimately where the conversation went with this local pastor. So we were talking in the middle of the bank. This literally like an hour, 2 hours ago. And he brought up and he said, it's a lot of these falls happen when pastors hit their 50s.
Okay.
And so let's think about it. A lot of the bad decisions pastors make, they make in their 50s, somewhere in there. and then often they don't get found out until their 60s or 70s, or they get caught in it, right? And it made me go, well, what happens in your 50s?
Yeah, that was the first question that happens in my head. Like, what's the click?
And I think I know what it is. And
Okay.
I'm not sure. I'm
You're right.
purely
Yep,
speculating, right?
yep, yep, yep,
So
yep.
here's what I think it is. I think so. I've been in ministry 24 years,
Yeah.
right? And there was a mentality, because the generation that now all this is coming to they would have been my parents or my older brothers, so to speak, in ministry.
Right.
So a lot of these guys are in their 60s, 70s. Um, the generation of pastors before me, there was an expectation that they had to be supermen.
Mm.
They had to be super leaders, super pastors, super communicators. They couldn't show weakness,
Mm.
and it was a very common thing.
Yeah.
Well, now imagine what happens when you've been doing ministry for 20, 25 years. And here's the point of life. If you have kids, right around this time is when your kids leave the nest.
Yep.
You've probably been doing ministry for a long time.
Yep.
And there's this old thing that says halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. You
Yeah.
never make decisions when you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, because that's when you're most susceptible.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, and I have no data to back this up. And there are exceptions. Like Carl Lentz was in his like late 30s when all this stuff happened.
Right.
Mark Driscoll was in his mid 40s. Um, but I think that the commonality, the common denominator still holds true, is that when you prop pastors and leaders up
Mm-hmm.
to where they have to be superhuman,
Yeah.
eventually the armor's gonna break,
Sure.
right? The cape's gonna get snagged in something.
Yeah, or the strength starts to wane a little bit or
Yeah,
whatever.
because everybody has their kryptonite, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
And to even like push up against maybe the more nefarious cases, like the less fall, more ran towards like
yes, yes.
situations, maybe they felt invincible.
Well, and that's the pride part.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, again, that can come in if you've got a track record of doing things. You're like, I'm awesome, I'm incredible,
Yeah.
and so now it's not even fatigue, it's arrogance.
Oh.
And he's like, yeah, that's interesting. So we had this conversation about it, and then I see Tony Evans, and he said this discretion, whatever it was, indiscretion, this sin happened a couple years ago. He didn't give a time, so it might have been in his 50s, his 60s, might have been last year. I don't know.
Sure.
Don't even care.
Yeah.
But it got me thinking about, like, why is it that we're seeing so many public pastors all of a sudden? We're just, it seems like almost every other week a name is getting thrown out.
Right.
And I go back, and I think I've shared this on the podcast before. So many years ago, that was my phone. I'm going to silence my phone here. I remember I was at a church, and we had several key leaders who were caught in some sins.
Mm.
And I remember going to my mentor at the time, and who was also my lead pastor, a guy named Per Nielsen, I'm hoping to get on the podcast. When we
Yeah.
do the travel, when we do Pocket
Yeah.
Theology on the road, I want to do an interview with him.
Stay tuned.
But I said, hey, I'm like, man, the devil's really at work here. Look at how the devil's moving. We need to pray against the enemy.
Yeah.
And he looked at me, and I still remember this, and he goes, why do you think it's the devil?
Right.
And he goes, what if it's the Holy Spirit exposing
Yeah.
lies and cleaning and
Yeah.
purifying?
Yeah.
And I think about this now, and here I am. I'm coming up on my 25th year of ministry.
Dang, man.
So I started in 2000. And I have a lot more empathy
Mm.
for not those who fall into arrogance, though I could understand how it would be easy to do that, because there's certainly been times in my ministry life where I've struggled with arrogance.
I don't think sympathy means like you endorse. I think you can still sympathize with that and not be like advocating for it.
Yeah, I think if you believe your own hype long enough, and if everybody tells you how awesome you
Yeah.
are, and you have no one in your life telling you you're not always right, and not every decision you make is golden, or just because every decision you make is golden doesn't mean you're awesome.
Mm.
It means
Oh.
like some people, that every decision I make is right.
Mm-hmm.
That very well could be, but then praise the Lord for that, and then realize that you didn't make decisions in a vacuum. It's
Yeah.
not because you're that intelligent. It's because you might have been raised in a great home with some strong leaders, or maybe you had wonderful mentors, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then the other side is going on 24 years, almost 25 years of ministry. It's easy to let your guard down.
Right.
It's really easy.
Yeah.
It's to the point where that if you're not careful, you might even assume, oh no, my guard's up,
Mm.
and it's a false sense of security.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why I'm meeting with spiritual directors. I came in, and not that I saw my guard going down, but I'm like, I don't. What's the thing that could? What are the things that if I'm not careful could catch up with me?
Mm-hmm.
And then she asked me. She asked this great question. She said, "So what are you hoping to get out of this?"
Mm-hmm.
And my response is, and I've worked. I did therapy 5.5 years ago. I read a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I have really good friends. And I said, because I realized I've gone as far as I can take myself.
Yeah.
And so I need a Sherpa, so to speak.
Well, yeah, we're just an outside representative that wants to speak into the things that they notice or see
But
or
someone who's trained.
right.
I
Yeah.
don't I don't want a layperson to be like, "Oh, Jason, I want somebody who's actually knows they're Sherpas. They know what they're
Yeah.
doing."
Yeah.
Right? Just and I think about what is it, Mount Everest or K2, they have Sherpas, that the Himalayans, that these Sherpas guide them.
Yeah.
And these are people who are experienced mountain climbers.
Yeah. Well, you always said that you should always have someone discipling and pouring into you, and you're always pouring into someone,
Yeah.
right? It's like that thing.
Paul, Timothy, Barnabas
Yeah.
rule is what I
You're
is.
you're looking for that.
Yeah, and I've got mentors,
Yeah.
but not from a soul care, because what I want to, I'm now in the, I would say, the middle of my ministry calling.
Sure.
I'm not at the end.
Right.
I'm not at the beginning. I'm not a young pastor. I've been doing this quite a while now.
Yeah.
Uh, and if I want to finish well, the best way to finish well is to make sure that you do well in the middle.
Yeah, no kidding. Because if you sprint at the beginning of that race, you're gonna get tired. Or if you're not maintaining a good, consistent speed,
Yeah.
you're not gonna make it.
Bob Buford wrote a book called Finishing Well that is all about how do you make sure that in the end years of your life and your career, whatever it is, that you finish well. And I'm like, well, I think the best way to finish well is to do the middle well,
Yeah.
to start well. And some people don't start well, but they finish well. But I don't want to be somebody who started mediocre. And I'll say it, I started mediocre. I don't think I started well.
I think all of us start mediocre.
Yeah, I think most people do, right? And I think I started.
And I think if you think you're starting with the golden like foundation, you're gonna learn real fast.
Well, that's when I say I didn't start well. I think I did. I think I thought I was awesome when I
Yeah.
started, and also because early on, in my first youth ministry, we had really quick success, at least from a worldly perspective, numbers, kids, that kind of stuff. Excuse me. And I didn't have the character behind it. And
Yeah.
I've shared that. I mean, I got fired from my first youth ministry. It's so funny, when I was interviewing here, someone goes, "You probably shouldn't tell people that you got fired from your first youth ministry." I'm like, that was 17 years ago, or 17 years ago. I'm
We
like,
are all the exact same people that we were
yeah.
17 years ago.
And I'm like, are you kidding? I use it not as a badge of honor, like I got fired. Some people, but more
But
of like
it's a badge of humility. I'd rather someone wear a badge of humility than a badge of like.
well, I learned from it.
You're right.
Right? Some
Right.
people brag when they get fired, like, I was a strong leader and they couldn't handle it. No, I was arrogant and immature and insecure, and I totally deserved to be fired. And so now I'm looking and I'm going, okay, I'm in the middle stages, so to speak, of my career.
Yeah.
Not in the beginning. And I'm like late middle. I've got probably another 10, 15 years, Lord willing, where I would say that I'm in that capability of being able to speak to multiple generations. So the rule of thumb that I heard was that as a pastor, you're most effective to the generation above and below you.
Right.
Right? Which would make sense why youth pastors tend to be in their 20s.
Sure.
Who's the generation above them? It's the parents.
Yep.
And who's the generation below them? It's the kids.
Yep.
And so for me, like, I don't have a clue how to talk to high schoolers anymore. I did youth ministry for 6 years. I spoke at youth group a couple months ago, and I was like, I don't know if anything I said made sense. Who knows? But that means that from a lead pastor perspective, there's going to come a point in which my primary responsibility is, how do I hand this off? How do I leave well or end well or step aside so the next person can do it. And I wonder, this goes back to the why I talked about all these people falling, is I wonder if part of the reason why some of these leaders, these high profile pastors, fell into sin, into abusive patterns, it's because they didn't think about the longevity of their ministry and of what they were doing, and specifically about their health throughout of it. I think there's an assumption, like, especially if you're a strong leader, I'm always going to be strong.
Yeah, I think another downfall is like this is gonna sound kind of like macabre, but uh, preparing for the end,
Yeah.
getting ready. What does it look like when your time is done?
Oh, and this is, I was telling one of my spiritual leadership team guys, uh, I'm already thinking about that
Yeah,
because one again, I want to end well, and the best way to end well, and this is a phrase that I didn't coin it, I got it from somewhere, I just don't remember where. So I'm not meaning to steal somebody's. I'm plagiarizing, but unintentionally. I want someone to stand on my shoulders, not my toes,
yeah,
right? And so that means there's gonna come a point in time where I have to hold this very openly, open-handed,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And a lot of the leaders who fall, they're very close-handed,
They think that that's not gonna end. They think they've got it.
and it's theirs.
Yes. Oh, it's not theirs. That's now I have a quote, but I can source it.
Yeah.
Hamilton.
Oh,
It's like legacy.
yeah,
Legacy is planting seeds in a garden you'll never get to see.
yeah. Were you gonna wrap it next? So all this conversation got me thinking about, like, when somebody falls or they fall into sin and they have to step away from ministry. There's definitely, I think I've seen ones where there are people who've had these experiences and they handled it very well. They were
Mm,
repentant. They got counseling. Some have even said, like, I have a friend of mine who I will not say his name, but was in ministry, ended up was removed from ministry because of sin and decided, I don't think I'm called back into it.
mm,
I don't think I can handle that. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of wisdom in that, because when you find your identity in something, to give it up, even for sin, is hard.
yeah,
And then you have examples of pastors who to this day are still white knuckling, oh, I'm a victim. I didn't do any of this, no matter how much evidence is against them.
sure.
And then you have other pastors who are saying, no, there might come a point in time where I want to be restored,
Yeah,
and people come alongside. And this is the problem with our cancel culture, is I think we're so quick. If some people we've canceled who didn't need to be canceled in ministry, they needed to be restored, and they were repentant and
yeah,
humble, and we can restore them. And this brings me to Carl Lentz, right? Carl Lentz did some pretty horrible things. Didn't murder anybody. There was some spiritual abuse, it sounds like, within his staff because of brokenness. Had an affair on his wife, and it sounds like he's gotten counseling and healing. And there might come a point in time where maybe, just maybe, he feels the Lord is calling him back to ministry with high levels of accountability.
yeah,
And it's hard because in our culture, I wonder if I mean, for sure, I think we'll let people in. I mean, this is, if I were to say, one of the hard parts of guys like Mark Driscoll, and I'm not anti Mark Driscoll by any means, but there was no restoration process for him.
sure.
His church blew up. He got angry, stepped away for a year, planted a new church, and
Yeah.
his church is blowing up. And there's, in a good way, like, it's
Yes.
growing,
Yeah.
right? And one of the criticisms that has been leveled against him is there was no restoration process. There was no, hey, I took more than a year away. I took time to figure out what led to these things. It was a year went by. All right, I've got enough time now. I'm going to go launch a new church.
Right. And people are nervous or fearful that really no healing took place. It just kind of
Well,
jumped back into the fray.
if you watch the rise or listen to the rise and fall of Mars Hill, that was certainly a big part of that.
Gotcha.
And yet, there's also, like, God's clearly using them.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think this also goes back to another reason why falls happen, or why we cover things up, is that when somebody's really effective, we'll ignore their sin as long as they're effective.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I think it's character over ministry.
Well, it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Character over competency is what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so as we look at that, it got me again. I was studying parable of the prodigal son this week, and that's kind of what led me down all this. Is you know, the parable in Luke 15, we have the parable of the lost coin,
Mm-hmm.
parable of the lost sheep, and the parable of the lost son,
Mm-hmm.
which we often think is one son, but in reality, there are two sons. The older brother and the younger brother are both lost. Listen to the message, you'll hear it on Sunday. Um, but sometimes we assume that lost is because of outward sin, very obvious sin.
Right.
So it's the drugs, alcohol, it's the pornography, it's
Yeah.
the cheating, it's doing all those things. And we look and say, oh, they were wayward, they fell away from the Lord.
Yeah.
And yet, then at the end of the parable, we see the oldest son is equally lost. It just looks better.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think as churches, we have a lot of lost older brothers in ministry
Mm.
who, somewhere along the way, either they didn't have the character
Yeah.
or they didn't care for the character.
Yeah.
And
I'm gonna quote another musical
yeah,
thing
go for it.
here
Go for it.
because it's all about music today. Ben Fuller has a really good quote in one of his songs I really like. It says, he says, "From prodigals on bar stools to pretenders in the church pews, nobody's ever really too far gone."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's exactly like there's character is and we see this all we don't just see it in ministry, we see it in sports.
Yeah.
We see it all over the place where you can start off with really high character,
Yeah.
and if there's the assumption is that the character just sustains itself. No, it doesn't.
No, no. Oh my gosh, you have to cultivate it. You have to work on it all the time. You have to put in accountability pieces. You have to start
All the things you don't
evaluating.
want.
Yeah.
It
Oh
requires
gosh.
work.
It requires taking responsibility.
Yeah. So if we were to look at it from a different analogy, like movie stars are notorious because they have chiseled abs and muscles and all the things, right?
Same.
And exactly, me too, me too. It's so rough. It's so
Oh,
rough.
it's so hard being this beautiful.
It's so hard being that ripped and jacked, right? And what people don't realize is that some people might be genetically gifted,
Yeah.
but there's going to come a point in time where that doesn't matter. Genetics don't matter. Everybody's bodies eventually fall apart.
Yeah.
But you hear about these guys who, Christian Bale,
Mm-hmm.
for The Machinist, got down
Oh
to like
my
120
gosh.
pounds and looked like a
Yeah.
skeleton. You could see not just his ribs, but his
Yeah.
spinal column.
Yeah. Joaquin Phoenix did it too for Joker. Like just lost an absurd amount of
Absurd
weight.
amount of weight, right? And then in 6 months, he gained like 65 pounds for
Yeah.
Batman.
Yeah.
And here's the thing: you listen to him, and Dave Bautista just talked about this. And now I promise I'm going somewhere. I'm not just fanboy.
No, we're getting it. We're getting it.
They all said the work it takes to maintain that body is hard.
Yeah.
In fact, that's most of what their job is maintaining a look
Yeah.
so they can look buff.
And then and so much so that we try to emulate it. Like, you want Tom Holland's workout plan to look like Spider-Man? Here you go.
Yeah, let that be your full-time job. But the other part, that's aesthetic. Character
Yeah.
is something that true character means you continually put the work in, not so that other people see it, but because you see it.
Yes. But that's why I brought up that like workout plan to
Yeah.
look like Tom Holland deal. Like, people are searching for the character piece too, I think.
Oh yeah.
So like people latch onto he's a really popular like men's motivational speaker, Peter
Rollins,
no.
Ed
Anyway,
Milet.
but people are looking for that like moral or character compass too, I think.
Well, and that's the difference between the body. The body can look good on the outside and be crud in the
Yeah.
inside, right? Character, there are some people who will look good on the outside, but that's not character.
Mm-mm.
That's being a character. That's
Sure.
playing a character.
Sure.
True character is an inward journey, and it's continual. And the hardest part about character work
Mm-hmm.
is that most people don't see the work you put in.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And just like at the gym, right? Just like these guys who are working out, you don't see all the work they do to get the body, the biceps, Chris Hemsworth looking like Thor. There's a genetic predisposition towards that, but they still have to work really hard.
Mm-hmm.
From a character, from a who you are as a person, you have to do the work and realize that most people won't see it.
Yeah.
They'll only see it when it's not there.
Yeah.
That's the hardest part about character is the only time you realize I don't have character is when you don't
when
see
you've
it.
shown how you lack it.
So the real evidence of character is the fact that no one's looking and seeing a lack of character in my life. So there's not an immediate reward system. No one sees when you're gracious
Yeah.
or when you're loving or patient.
Yeah.
That's not
It doesn't go celebrated very often.
no, or is it easily seen?
Yeah.
It's not a very easily seen. But man, you have an outburst,
Oh,
or if
sure.
you're anger and rage, everybody sees it. And
Yeah.
so that's when I was a student in high school, my youth pastor put together, and I don't know if he made it or got it from somewhere else. It's called the 10 non-negotiables.
Okay.
And they were things that we 10 non-negotiables as Christians, right? And one of them was it takes a lifetime to build a good reputation, one unguarded moment to destroy it.
Yep.
And that's the hardest part about character is that you're doing all this work and the average person not only doesn't see the work you're putting in, but may not even know that you are a person of character, which is the evidence
Yeah.
that you're a person of character. Unlike bodybuilding or working out, you can tell when I've gone to the gym
Yeah.
because I get big muscles and I look better or whatever. That's an outward thing, but you can't always see
Yeah.
the work of character until you see the lack of character.
Yeah. My mind goes back to the parable of the prodigal son that you were just mentioning.
Yeah.
And how I think like what we've been talking about so far is very worldly perspective, like muscles or even the character piece where you've built up this great reputation. You had one unguarded moment, you ripped it down. Now the world cancels you or you've
Yeah.
lost your position or things like that. And when I think of the prodigal son, I'm I'm not encouraged to go make mistakes, but I'm encouraged that it also only took one moment of letting your pride down,
Yeah.
repentance, turning back to God for him to laugh and weep and open his arms
Yeah.
to you. And that's the start of restoration. It's not the finish. Because, yeah, they threw a big party and they celebrated the prodigal son came home and stuff. But I want to know, like if I ever get up to like heaven, I get to talk to Jesus about this. I was like, I would have loved to have heard the next following couple of months to see
Yeah.
what that son had to do to change
In the
right?
story. Yeah. If
Yeah.
Jesus had continued the
Yeah, if
story.
he would have
Because it's not
continued
a
it,
true
because it's not a
story.
true story, right? But and
Actually, it is a true story. It's just not a factual story. It
yes,
didn't happen.
it's a true story, as in it is life, but
It
it's
is
not
true, but
what
it's not
happened.
fact. It didn't
Yes,
actually
yeah.
happen. Yeah.
But do you kind of see where
I
I'm heading
do.
there?
Well, and I think this is the other part is that when we understand grace,
Yeah,
when we understand that the Father not only is God for us, but when we sin, God God's anger, yes, he's angry when we sin. God hates sin. But he so desperately wants us to come home
yeah,
and to speak the truth into our lives,
yeah,
to help us reshape and reform. Because what was it? 2 years ago, we did the whole formed, reformed, deformed,
yeah.
conformed, right?
Yep,
And there are things that deform our souls.
yep,
There are things in our life that affect us, that de-shape us, that take us away what God intended us. And if we were to use the imagery of a potter with clay,
yep,
the world deforms us regularly. It ruins our shape. It crushes us. It breaks us. And God has this incredible ability through Jesus, through the Holy Spirit, through church, which is why I thought about Tony Evans,
yeah.
of coming alongside of things because we've all been deformed in some way.
Oh yeah,
And here's what breaks my heart is there are pastors who have faithfully served the Lord. They make a bad decision and that now defines them from people's perspective. And that's why I think it matters how you respond. I think, it's this kindness that leads to repentance, is what Romans says. And what greater story than to see somebody who not only acknowledges their brokenness, says, hey, yes, there were things in my life that happened, but that doesn't excuse my choices.
yeah,
Because the reason why a form gets deformed, which then leads to sin, is because instead of going to Jesus and dealing with the deforming, you ignore it. And
Yeah.
therefore, when you sin, it's now on you.
yeah,
So if I know that my soul if I know that things are going wrong and I'm not taking care of it, well, then when I sin, I can't blame anybody else.
yeah,
I can't go, well, this happened to me when I was this and this happened. No, that's my responsibility because at some point I could have said, oh, there's a deforming there I need, which is why I'm looking at working with spiritual directors going, I know there are areas in my life that have been deformed because of sins I've done
Yep.
and sins done to me.
yeah,
And I want to make sure that I'm tending to those, but also, and again, I don't know who said this, but the only hidden sin is a secret sin, or the
Yep.
only deadly sin is a secret sin.
Okay. Okay.
Is that when you keep sin secrets, that's when the cancer grows. And so
Sure.
sin can't grow in the light.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like oftentimes now we're only really caring about the sin when it gets brought to light.
Yeah. And that's our culture.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think this is interesting because we talk about the prodigal son, and we could get into a whole conversation about truth versus facts, which I know
Sure.
we've also talked about in previous episodes. But there is like we're clearly seeing a lot of Christian leaders, kind of pastors,
Mm-hmm.
who, man, I think God is purifying his bride, including those pastors.
Mm-hmm.
He's rescuing them.
Yeah.
But I think it's also that God wants his church to be healthy.
Of course.
And that means its leaders need to be healthy, but also the people need to be healthy.
Yeah.
And so, Jesus says, as you have forgiven, you will be forgiven.
Mm.
And so it's the same thing. Like, man, I need to forgive because I want to be forgiven in those moments where I've stumbled and
Mm.
failed.
So in this conversation, what's like a key takeaway or something that we could leave our viewers with to wrap up and just let them be encouraged by or maybe even
Yeah.
challenged by? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think there's two things that I would say. One is don't elevate your leaders.
Mm.
Don't make pastors more than they are. They're human. And in fact, I think one of the reasons why we see pastors who fall is they get elevated and they
Mm.
start believing their own hype.
Yeah.
Elevating a pastor is not the same as respecting a pastor,
Right.
right? Two, I think it's important that we recognize that our own propensity towards not doing the work of character, of developing the things that no one sees, and that's not just true of pastors. That's true of all people, and especially as Christians. Like, I had a conversation recently with somebody. Is why is it that the fruit of the Spirit seems to be more emphasized than the gifts of the Spirit?
Mm.
And I think there's a reason for this. Jesus tells another parable, which we'll be talking about in a few weeks, but the sheep and the goats. And you can have pretend fruit, you can prophesy, you can evangelize, you can heal, and not have a relationship with Jesus. But
Mm.
here's the part: you cannot love like Christ, be merciful like Christ, be gracious like Christ without knowing Christ.
Mm.
Which is why the fruit of the Spirit is way more important than the gifts of the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit is cultivated by being in the vine.
Yep.
The fruit of the Spirit is by coming and finding your source in Jesus.
Yeah.
The fruit of the Spirit is the work of the Spirit in our lives, and that means giving God access to every part of who we are.
Growing fruit takes work.
It does. And so if I could give a challenge is one, no matter where you are, it's never too late to repent,
Mm. Amen.
right? Two, let's have grace and mercy on people, including pastors, especially when they own their garbage
Yeah.
and say, "Hey, I failed." Let's not buy into the gossip. It's not helpful to always know why somebody sins. Sometimes that's worse. So instead of speculating or assuming the worst, let's trust the fact that they're bringing it out is in itself a bold action. But then also knowing there's leaders who are bringing it around. But I think here's the bigger thing that I would end with: when we sin, the reason why we can take comfort and know that I can confess is because I have a loving Father who's not shocked by my sin.
Mm.
He's not shocked by yours. He's heartbroken by it.
Yeah.
And instead of walking away or growing distant from the Father, that's what should bring us back to the Father.
Yes.
To run into his arms, to let him reshape us when we've been deshaped,
Mm.
so to speak. So there's a lot of takeaways, but it really, it's been hitting me, particularly this last year, because it just seems like at least once a month, we're finding about some new leader
Yeah.
who's falling. Before that, it seemed like twice or three times a year, but literally it's been like almost every month, some major figure
Yeah.
is falling.
But I am glad that like you're hearing these things and even I am as you're describing them, I'm hearing these things and I'm not sitting here thinking, gosh, look at how sucky everything is and
Yeah.
how much everyone sucks. I think, okay, where do I need to start looking into my stuff if this is what's happening to people even I respected. Like,
Yeah.
I really like that guy. Ooh,
And don't think that just because you're not because you're not in a public ministry that God doesn't care about those things. Because I
well,
know
we're
more
all
people.
in a public ministry.
Yeah. Well, and I've known plenty of Christians who've blown up their families,
Yeah. Ugh.
ended up divorced, ended up in addiction, ended up in really
Which is
bad
the
places.
only ministry that,
It's the most important one.
yeah,
Yeah.
really, truly. All right. Well, hey, man, thanks so much for the great discussion,
Yeah.
Jason.
Good
As always,
conversation.
dude, you're awesome.